So first I want to thank everyone for joining us here. I'm Philip Cornell. I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. And we're here to launch this report on international grid integration. The aim of the report is to sort of look over the horizon at some of the emerging geopolitics of the energy transition. Cross-border electricity trade is not new. But in terms of global volume, it really picked up after 2000 with liberalization in Europe and the development of key power pools. Now the focus has shifted to emerging economies where electricity demand is actually happening, is growing, and where much cheaper renewables are helping to reach ambitious national targets over the next decade and beyond. The report looks at three key subregions, the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, where demand is rising and where efforts to create regional electricity markets have been ongoing. Donors and multilateral development banks have been trying for decades to encourage regional power market integration broadly along the European model, with limited success and insufficient local buy-in, despite the efficiencies and the cost savings that it represents. Now the moment is really ripe. Cheap renewables are here, undercutting fossil fuels in most situations. A future with almost free electricity doesn't seem so far off. The costs now are largely about integrating those renewables into the grid and delivering reliable electricity. At 2, 3, or 4%, those costs could be negligible. But at 20 or 30 or 40%, or even close to 100% renewable penetration that some politicians advocate, the costs are really significant. International grid integration and electricity trade can be an enabling tool and can provide significant cost savings by optimizing regional generation and reducing the need for excess baseload capacity. The challenges are largely political and institutional. So this report looks less at the technical aspects and more at the political economy of electricity trade and grid integration in these regions. What are the institutional changes that are necessary? And are increasing cost benefits enough to overcome some of the political hurdles at the national and regional levels to realize those benefits? This region is a leading example. Since 2001, the GCC Interconnection Authority has been an advanced model for institutionalizing regional interconnection, building and owning the backbone circuits capable of regular commercial exchange. But there's also a geopolitical aspect to all of this. New financing and construction opportunities for grid infrastructure presented by China's Belt and Road program and by state-owned enterprises like China's State Grid can be very attractive in developing Asia and the Middle East. State Grid has advanced a government-sanctioned vision for global energy interconnection along an integrated supergrid for Asia and eventually worldwide. Now, that may be quite far off and maybe a bit of marketing, but it provides an enticing vision. Continental grid balancing that can improve sustainability by harnessing remote renewable resources and smoothing out variability. It's one roadmap towards deep decarbonization through deep integration. This report argues that BRI and GEI can also present real and perceived risks of energy dependence in some countries and raises nearer-term questions about lending terms, foreign ownership and operation of transmission, cybersecurity around grid management, and supply chain dominance. The Atlantic Council sits in Washington, and this report is aimed at a US policy audience that is conscious about regional influence around big connectivity infrastructure programs like the BRI. The report's principal message to that audience is that the best way to address those challenges and assuage concerns is to provide legal and technical support to partner governments and regional electricity organizations to ensure transparent markets and pricing, sound infrastructure procurement, and cybersecurity. It means reinforcing institutions and engaging partners in Asia and the Middle East, as well as China, around issues like standards, competition, and terms of trade. But the other message is to say that in the face of big visions, like global interconnection and continental supergrids that require some degree of supranational coordination, it's worth presenting an alternative vision, and one that focuses more on decentralization and more on local choice and control. The US is contending with market innovations to incorporate much more distributed energy, to aggregate microgrids to participate in capacity markets, and even prioritize DER in max DSO models. Even if distributed generation now operates at the grid margin, cheaper storage and much cheaper generation, together with new meters and inverters and demand response, could make largely self-sufficient local grids a key element of providing the kind of system reliability and smoothing offered by big cross-border transmission. So to discuss this issue, these issues, we have a fantastic panel here. To my left, Engineer Ahmed Al-Ibrahim is the Chief Executive Officer of the Gulf Cooperation Council Interconnection Authority, in charge of the 400 kilovolt supergrid backbone interconnecting the 6 national grids of Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Oman, and Kuwait. He's been with the GCCIA for over 11 years, and he has over 3 decades of experience in power systems. Monali Zia Hazra has been the Program Management Specialist in Clean Energy and Environment Office at the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, in India for the last 10 years. She's currently the India Country Coordinator for the South Asia Regional Initiative for Energy Integration. And finally, at the end, Matthew Zace is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of International Affairs at the U.S. Department of Energy. Previously, Dr. Zace served for 2 years in the White House as a director on the National Security Council, where, among other responsibilities, he coordinated U.S. interagency efforts to deliver energy independence and advocate for competitive energy markets across the Middle East. So I want to start with a couple of questions for everyone on the panel about where we see the future grid developing. There's clearly a lot of uncertainties, but I think it's important to talk about trajectories and how we can kind of envision the future. So, Engineer Ahmed, I'd like to start with you. The GCC has really been a leader, as we mentioned, about institutionalizing power market interconnection and includes members like the UAE that have really led on domestic sector reform with ambitious clean energy targets. And the GCCIA is really a powerful tool in the region, even if utilization is still growing, let's say. So how do you expect electricity trade and interconnection in the GCC and maybe the wider Middle East to develop over the next decade and beyond, particularly if we think about high renewable scenario or high renewables penetration?
Thank you, Philip. Well, the GCC interconnection is quite a strategic project that has started as an idea more than 20 years ago. It took us a long time to realize it, but over time we've managed to develop quite a unique physical and corporate structure. In terms of physical structure, we have a backbone structure, unlike other interconnections where you have a country-to-country interconnection, and sometimes you have to go through the internal network of the grids, the national grids. We have a backbone structure, practically an electricity highway that connects the 6 countries of the Gulf. And that has big advantages. The second one is the corporate structure that we developed. It's a framework that encompasses certain agreements. So we have a general agreement which sits on the top, which is basically a treaty signed between the 6 member states, giving the rights, privileges, and the responsibilities of each of the member states towards this entity or this project. Secondly, we have an elaborate power exchange and trade agreement that will set up all the conditions for exchanging and trading electricity. I think that has set up the GCC interconnection in a good position to assist the GCC countries in addressing the energy transition. Basically, with this kind of the physical structure, we have more than 2,000 megawatts of capacity of exchange that can be done. Of course, maybe this is small now, but I think this, in terms of concept, can be developed and expanded. But now, as you mentioned, Philip, the utilization factor is only 10%. And what we are trying to do is to develop the GCC electricity market. We're starting with bilateral trading that will really help the member states to get economic values from the trading. I mean, if we utilize the interconnector in a good way, we can, according to our study, achieve more than $1 billion a year of savings, economic savings, because of savings in electricity costs and fuel and operational cost, and that is proven by the study. And that's why we are really taking on big plans to develop electricity trading. For the last 4 years, for instance, we've been giving incentives to the member states by lowering our wheeling charges and by facilitating bilateral trading, and that has resulted in a big jump in trade volume. In 2016, we exceeded 700 gigawatt hours of trade from zero. And year after year, we're getting, for the last 3-4 years, around 20% increase in the volume of trading. And this is only bilateral trading. The second thing is that we have launched last year the GCC Electricity Exchange. And that part is where we can have a spot market. We're starting with the day-ahead market, and we are going to introduce more and more products in the future. The intraday market, the futures market, maybe ancillary markets. But the bottom line is that we are trying to set up the interconnector to be an enabler of the energy transition. Big amounts of renewables are being installed in our system. You can see a huge target for Saudi Arabia, for UAE. We see a project in UAE in hundreds of megawatts coming every few months, especially with the low prices of PVs that are coming in. Now, with high penetration of renewables, maybe if we reach 20%, electricity interconnection will become a must, because you cannot integrate that amount of renewables into the system without having sufficient interconnection grids. Otherwise, that will affect your resilience, it will affect the availability of resources. And that's why we are working in tandem with the member states to develop these kind of capacities. We are doing studies. We have a joint study with IPRI that will determine certain guidelines on how do we integrate the renewables and what kind of measures we have to have. Maybe some guidelines on the development targets on the member states. But this is done because now we are one grid in the GCC, and we have to really accommodate the renewables. So bottom line, the electricity interconnection now is a must, and we are working with the member states to make sure we are ready to assist them to integrate renewables in a good way.
Great. Thanks very much. And I'm glad you mentioned the EPRI partnership in terms of how the GCCIA is thinking about adding on new technologies, also around things like AI and blockchain. So those kind of partnerships can be very valuable. Great. Thanks very much. Manali, maybe next I'll come to you. Your work focuses a lot on South Asia and where USAID is supporting infrastructure development. So same kind of question, how do you see electricity markets developing there? And what will be the role of transmission and cross-border trade in the development?
Thank you, Philip. So basically what we have seen in South Asia over the past few years, from 2013 onwards itself, the power trade has gone significantly up. It's almost increased by 3,000 megawatt. And going forward, we also think that it's going to increase more and more, the power trading in the region, and having a more vibrant power market. So basically why I say that is mainly because of few things. First of all, Government of India last year came up with a policy which allows for, trilateral power trade. Most of the power trade which happened in the region thus far has been bilateral in nature. So just this allows countries like Nepal and Bhutan to trade with Bangladesh using India's transmission line. This itself is going to boost up power trade in the region. Secondly, the same policy allows now the neighboring countries to participate in the day-ahead market, India's day-ahead market, which was a no-no till now. So that again allows for better efficiencies in the system and it's likely that it will boost up the power trade in the region. Third, and I think which is the most important, is that India has set itself a huge renewable energy target. It plans to have a 175 gigawatt of renewable energy by 2022, which was enhanced to 450 gigawatt by 2030 by the Prime Minister recently. So, going forward, they are looking at having a broader integrated grid as a way forward to manage their integration, RE integration challenges. They also see that there are hydro potential of Nepal and Bhutan, which could be a good balancing resources for more renewable energy in the system. And India itself is doing a lot in terms of market reforms. It's planning to bring in real-time market rules as well as ancillary services markets. So things are moving, which provides better opportunity for the neighboring countries also to participate in the market. And I think the most important factor is also the fact that whatever trade which has happened in the region has shown benefits. Bangladesh, for instance, saves almost 500 takas every year just by switching the more costly fuel with the less cheaper one from India. Nepal has managed to overcome many of the power shortage in the Kathmandu Valley through the imports from India. And Bhutan itself earns like 50% of its revenues from hydropower exports. So all these are like concrete examples, which shows, which provides a good examples or impetus to the countries in the region that yes, this is the way forward, and that's why I think it's going to increase. Transmission interconnection definitely is important. It makes this a reality. Without that, there's no trade going to happen. And unfortunately, the transmission interconnection has not kept the same pace. So though we have interconnection between India, Nepal, India, Bangladesh, and India, Bhutan, but it's slow. And the countries have set up these working groups to set up more in transmission interconnection. And even India and Sri Lanka are in talks to develop the underground cable. But this takes time, and transmission interconnection take time, and often there are questions about how much and how do we share the cost between the two countries. So that's one of the challenges. There are also issues of different capacity in the subcontinent. So that also has to be at the common level. There needs to be a common operating standards. And one major issue is obviously the political scenario that can really push the project forward or really delay it. So all the examples I spoke about is from the Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, the eastern subcontinent part, but we have seen no development on the western subcontinent. That's very much because of the various issues between India, Pakistan, or the political dynamics. So things have really not moved. So political will is really important. Secondly, I also think that building the trust of not only within the energy fraternity, it's also important to engage the civil society, the politician, the bureaucrats. That's very important. So one of the things we found out when we were implementing SARI was mainly, civil society in Nepal was dead against many of the regional power projects because they felt that why should we be exporting power to India when in Nepal itself is facing so much of power access issue. So there is a need to be, to engage the civil society also in the dialogue, bring them in this whole conversation. And and there are emerging challenges like cybersecurity and grid security, which we haven't started talking about. So those are also going to be one of the important challenges.
Thanks very much, Monali. I mean, absolutely. When we talk about sort of the political will in India really being sort of at the heart of regional trade there, it seems like sometimes it can swing back and forth. I mean, when Prime Minister Modi was first elected, there was sort of a gung-ho move towards really increasing regional trade. And then there was sort of a pullback in 2016, and it was good to see last year that there was a really move forward to reinstate a lot of those trading abilities. Great, thanks very much. Maybe I'll move to Matt at the end. Matt, what's the view from the Department of Energy and from the U.S. about, I would say, Asian power markets and trade overall? And maybe you can speak a little bit to, what's the role of China in the buildup of regional transmission distribution systems? And, is it something that we should be concerned about, or even if it seems to be bringing some benefits?
Thanks, Phil. I guess I got the easy questions on especially China. So thanks for having us. I'll quickly review Asia, how we view Asia, and I had some India statistics, but I'll leave that to my colleague that knows those much better than me. Despite the penetration and the increasing viability of the economic model for the renewables and their penetration, we still see, based off of economic and population growth and the associated urbanization, it's going to continue to drive a steady increase in energy demand across Asia, and I think we're all appreciative of that. And that demand is going to have to be met by fossil fuels for some time. But that also is going to require some significant improvements in power generation, transmission, distribution, and then the question then is who finances that and who installs that capacity, and I'll talk about that a little bit with China, with our comments and sort of thoughts on the Chinese role there. But with this and the demand on fossil fuels, we firmly believe that in the United States, natural gas is going to continue to play a pivotal role in meeting that future demand in Asia. With the falling domestic gas supplies in countries like Thailand and Indonesia, the demand for gas is expected to exceed supply by 2025. And this is going to drive demand for gas imports, and we as the United States are prepared to meet that demand with our our LNG exports. But also, as Philip has noted, we appreciate, my Assistant Secretary for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy is here as well, that with renewable energy costs continuing to fall, coupled with the aggressive renewable energy targets that my colleagues have already mentioned, we believe this is a significant investment opportunity that the United States can be part of in Asia. In terms of specific areas of cooperation, the 10 ASEAN countries have an ASEAN power grid initiative aimed at constructing a regional power interconnection to connect the region first on the cross-border bilateral terms and then gradually to expand to a sub-regional basis. This entails the development of 22 cross-border power grids projects totaling 26.5 gigawatts of capacity that will strengthen the regional energy trade, which is expected to increase by $20 billion by 2025. The U.S., in terms of these efforts, the U.S. objective is to work with partners in the region to develop free, open, stable, rules-based regional electricity markets. And the areas of our cooperation include developing new and reviewing existing national and regional transmission plans, assisting governments to establish synchronous regional grid codes for cross-border electricity trade, and to establish technical, legislative, and regulatory standards and rules related to access, which we think is critical. But with all that said, to the second part of Philip's question comes the question of what the role of China and where the United States views that as Asian countries try to meet their domestic demands. And I think what was sort of highlighted throughout Philip's paper is this tension between the need to regionally interconnect electricity requirements while also safeguarding the concerns of sovereignty and security. And so in terms of China, in the United States, we recognize that the major role that China plays in global trade, including electricity, construction, and supply chain. And as countries seek to manage their own economic and trade relationship with China, we encourage them to make choices in line with their own sovereignty and economic well-being by fully accounting for the long-term political, technological, and economic risks and costs associated with the potential singular dependence on one source in terms of China. We see as the party state in Beijing is able to exert a significant amount of influence over many Chinese companies and investors, both public and nominally private, through economic, political, and technical means. And then in doing so, they have the ability to compel or persuade firms to serve the regime's interests, sometimes at the expense of the partner country's interests and values. And we've seen that in several cases where they've succeeded in obtaining economic concessions and the possession of strategic assets as collateral for debts that recipient countries cannot pay, specifically in terms of Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Kenya, or related to infrastructure projects that are unprofitable and even economically unfeasible, as we've seen in Ecuador and Sri Lanka. And so while China has substantial assets through Southeast Asia, we are finding more and more desire from Southeast Asian nations to diversify their grid and bring in more American and other nations' T&D capabilities. And these economic partners are attracted to American companies and capabilities because of our free, open, and transparent business practices and the ability to provide high quality of outcomes for consumers at an affordable price. And furthermore, these deals do not compromise the sovereignty or economic stability of our partner nations. And so I think those are the challenges that we sort of foresee as electricity demand has to be met in a myriad of different ways. and the efficiencies need to be gained by regional interconnections, but the role that China has to play in that, and the position the United States takes in relation to that. So I'll leave it at there, and then maybe come back to GCIA later for another example.
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. I mean, maybe I'll stick with you for a moment because you brought up some interesting points. You talked a little bit about, what are some of the American programs in the region that are focusing on how to sort of ensure transparent markets and good sort of regulatory environments. And you mentioned places like in Southeast Asia where, just recently the Mekong Power Partnership seems to have been a key new initiative to further those kind of interests, and that is all sort of part and parcel of this Asia Edge program. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about Asia Edge. What are some of the objectives of the U.S. government with that program, and what sort of where does it sit within sort of the wider sort of free and open Indo-Pacific strategy?
Okay. Great, thanks, Philip. So the Asia Edge synchronizes, as you noted, the U.S. Indo-Pacific energy security efforts through 4 objectives. The first is to strengthen energy security of allies and partners. The second is to create open, efficient, rules-based, and transparent energy markets. The third is to improve free, fair, and reciprocal energy trading relationships. And the fourth is to expand access to affordable, reliable energy. But the aim of Asia Edge is not to replace, but to catalyze private sector investment. And the U.S. government plays a key role in creating the proper environment to accelerate private sector investment and open opportunities. But I'll be frank with you, sometimes we face a significant challenge in that because we just don't have the scale of financing that China does. But Asia Edge aims to expand the private-public partnerships, foster business-to-business connections, and help partner governments set transparent, market-based, and best value energy policies. But we're not trying to employ or deploy Asia Edge as an island, but also to build on its capabilities through existing multilateral platforms such as APEC, ASEAN, and the East Asia Summit, and on some of our bilateral White House initiatives such as the Japan-U.S. Strategic Energy Partnership, the U.S. and India Strategic Energy Partnership, and the Australian Strategic Energy Partnership. I think we will have the U.S. Strategic Energy Partnership with India showcased on the Friday of Sarah Week in Houston in March. So that's sort of, and to give one example, one of our technical areas of cooperation under the U.S.-India Strategic Energy Partnership focuses on modernizing the grid for improved power generation and distribution and improving its efficiency and effectiveness, and trying to work hard to assist India in reducing coal-fired power plant emissions. So I'll leave it there. Turn over to you, Phil.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, maybe we can just come back to Manali then, because if we continue along that discussion. I mean, sitting in India and sitting sort of in the USAID position, what do you see in terms of the U.S. efforts, in order to leverage private financing, for example, through the new U.S. DFC, or institutional support for sort of regional agreements that might be necessary to increase power trade in the region?
So USAID primarily focuses on working and creating an enabling environment which makes private investment more, easier. So that's what we will continue to do. Basically, focus around harmonizing of policies, regulations, operating processes, standards, common grid code, setting up market monitoring rules, as well as for a regional power market. And the other elements which I mentioned, working with the civil society, trying to engage them in the process. So that's what we will continue to focus on. And yes, one of the key stakeholders in this process would continue to be the regional institutions, some of the regional institutions like we have SARC. There's also another entity called SAFIR, or South Asia Forum of Infrastructure Regulators, and then there's BEAMSTEC. BEAMSTEC is it's a regional association comprising of 5 countries in South Asia, and then Thailand and Myanmar. So what the strategy which we have been adopting is that instead of focusing on one regional institutions, we'll work with all of them. So basically we are working and will continue to work with agencies like SARC in coming up in helping them implement the SARC Intergovernmental Framework Agreement. Because of this various issue, things have not moved, when in terms of our work in SARC. But we are working with them in coming up with common power purchase agreement as well as a common transmission interconnection standards. In BeamStack, we have primarily been, that's a relationship which is fairly new. We've been engaging with them since past 2 years or so, but there is, we will be working with them to help develop a BeamStack interconnection master plan, as well as, a lot of effort in terms of raising awareness. Many of these countries are already part of our existing program, and, some of them being new. And then we also are working with SAFIR, which is the infrastructure regulators. The idea here is, work with them in order to have them focus on harmonizing regulations and policies. And as a part of that, they have already set up a separate working group of energy regulators. In fact, they have agreed to set up a committee comprising of the chairperson. We're still not there as an independent entity, but at least this is a beginning. The chairpersons have all agreed to form a separate committee which focuses on looking at these issues. And one of the things which we are working currently is, a common minimum grid code, which is currently under review by different agencies. So regional institutions definitely important. But in other than these formal structures, we also think there's a lot of value in having informal forums and informal structures where the countries can come and meet and discuss, freely. Because many times what happens, the process is so bureaucratic when you are going through a SARC or a SAFIR, that this provides them just the opportunity to come together, discuss, and agree on some of the things like, what should be the market monitoring rules, or let's say the operating process and standards. So we are working to create institutions like, not institution, I would say, forums of South Asia, forum of system operator, as well as transmission utilities. And moving forward, maybe look at also if there is a need to go and have a South Asia forum of market operators. So that just to get all of them together to begin with, and maybe at a later stage they develop into a more formal kind of structures. So that's the approach. And yes, all these as a part of what we are doing, and also new initiative as a part of Asia, which my colleague already mentioned. And DFC provides a great opportunity. I mean, it's a great tool. USAID has, has limited funds, I would say, which focus primarily on the softer side of assistance, but we do not have enough funds to do infrastructure development. And having DFC bring in funds to do infrastructure development would be a great asset. Private sector engagement, specifically in South Asia, has been quite limited in regional projects. There have been some bit in terms of generation projects in Nepal, but nothing on the transmission. Mostly it's dominated by the government. There are a lot of issues perceived, they're not policies which encourage private sector participation. There's perceived risk. So we would continue to work as a part of USAID's initiative on some of the elements which my colleague mentioned as a part of transparent procurement processes, just bringing everybody on a common platform to discuss, all the country governments as well as private sector, to discuss some of the issues.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, it sounds very much like a lot of those processes are designed to build up sort of amongst stakeholders buy-in, right, and sort of develop that trust, which can take a lot of time. Engineer Ahmed, I mean, the GCCIA was really a success of exactly that process. I mean, managing to convince not only sort of stakeholders in all the countries, but convincing them to start to undertake the domestic reforms that are also necessary to enable trade. How did you come about that success so well in this region?
I would say that there are two key things. As Mona mentioned, political is very important. We've been doing studies since the 80s, and meetings and committees, and it was until we had the summit of the leaders of the GCC in 1999, I think it was. And then the Secretary General, he brought the folder of the GCC Interconnection project. He said, we either go ahead with this project or we scrap it, because we've been putting it forward, in each meeting. And in that meeting, they took the decision that, okay, let's go ahead, let's commit to establish a separate entity, and we charge it for doing this project, and let's give it the fund it needs, because it's a new entity, so they cannot go and finance this kind of project. And I think this was the key. There was a political will, and there was the commitment of the member states to go ahead and putting it in the right framework, not only for the current situation, but allowing it to evolve as the member states will evolve. For instance, for now, our power exchange and trade agreement has only, in terms of market participant, only 6 member states, which is basically the single buyers of each member state. And that is because of the current structure that we have in the GCC. Because in each country, you only have either a vertically integrated entity, or even if it's unbundled, you have one procurement party who has the legal right to buy and sell electricity. However, this can change in the future, and we see changes happening, for instance, in UAE and Oman, in Saudi Arabia. And our model will be flexible enough that it can accommodate new market participants. So later on, we can open up the market so that from each country, it's not only one, you have multiple countries, so that will accommodate these kind of changes. And I think the uniqueness of our model is what will make this happen in the future.
Great, thanks very much. Maybe what we'll do is then start opening this up to questions and comments. Oh, sorry, Matt, please. Yeah, you want to talk a little bit about the GCC?
I just wanted to, Engineer Ahmed, I really appreciate the comments, and Department of Energy has worked a lot with the GCCIA in the past, and on our current effort with Iraq. And GCC is the model, but I just wanted to highlight an example and demonstrate that to put on the table the opportunities that lie with grid interconnections, but also the challenges in terms of security, sovereignty, governance, et cetera. And it has to do with GCCI Interconnect, not because of your fault. You all are leading the way in trying to do this, but one of the objectives that the Department of Energy is trying to leverage with GCIA is to provide an alternative electricity source for Iraq through the GCIA. It's promising. It's probably the farthest along we've ever been, but it highlights a scenario in which the ability to interconnect grids can confront or collide with the political security realities on the ground. And the reason why I say that is because the only reason why the Iraq needs to connect to the GCCI grid is not because they don't have the ability to generate their own supply. It's because their own governance and security doesn't sort of enable them to produce their domestic supply and become the net exporter that they should be. Nevertheless, we're trying to leverage GCIA, but as we're doing that, at the same time as we're pursuing this effort for connecting Iraq, Iran is trying to synchronize its grid with Iraq, we believe, to probably try to enable itself to ship electricity to Syria with the overall objective of maintaining a dependency via Iraq and Syria. And I don't believe that the GCIA really wants to be connected to that kind of apparatus. So it's just an example of where the GCIA is such a leading example in the world in terms of regional interconnections. But as we try to bring other partners into the fold, it highlights the significant challenges that we face in areas where there's significant security, governance, or political concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think Engineer Ahmed you were telling me earlier that for something like a connection to Egypt, or it's a connection to Iraq, pardon me, the contracts are ready to go. But in fact, it's a political blockage to realize that. Great. Yes, Johannes, please. You've done some modeling work on these kind of issues in these regions. It would be great to hear what you have to say.
My name is Johannes Urpalan, and I'm at Johns Hopkins University at the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy. I wanted to just raise a few points about, first of all, renewables. So if you look at a region like South Asia, you see remarkable diversity in the power systems, resources, load profiles, really everything in these countries. So the potential for improved efficiency from trading is very significant. But at the same time, the political challenges really come to play here. We are right now doing some work to try to see how trade both between Indian states and between the different countries in the region would produce benefits and costs for different players. And that itself is a very hard problem. So It's obviously politically very sensitive because of the India and Pakistan issue in particular, but at the same time, the primary impact that China has is that it provides access to capital at reasonable interest rates to countries that do not have any other sources of capital. So overall, China is a big opportunity. There will be many governance challenges, and the host countries need to find ways to deal with this inflow and avoid instant debt trap. But overall, the opportunity is also very significant. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Johannes. Yeah, and I think it would point out that, you know, of the three regions that we're talking about, it's really only South Asia where China is not actively involved in building interconnections and transmission infrastructure between the countries itself. Obviously, it's very active within places like Bangladesh and Pakistan, but unlike, for example, in Southeast Asia, where it's been long active in building a lot of these interconnections for hydropower reasons, or even now in the Middle East, where we're starting to see a lot of involvement, particularly in the past year, of China State Grid. I mean, just last month, it bought a 50% stake in the Omani grid and has been signing MOUs with SA National Transmission in Saudi Arabia to precisely invest and build in some of these interconnectors in the region. Please.
Just a quick technical question, maybe a naive question. Over what distances can we now transmit electricity?
China is really at the forefront of a lot of this, particularly for high voltage direct current lines. And they've been really pushing the boundaries of this in conjunction with actually European partners. So ABB in Switzerland has been a big enabler of this. But they just opened a couple of months ago one that was about 3,200 kilometers and about a little over 1 million volts, 1.1 million volts. So that seems to be the record at the moment.
From our part, I think we've done already some kind of initial studies because in our vision, we look to connect Asia, Africa, and Europe. So we've done initial studies. And definitely HVDC will be the means to transfer it. With the developments that are happening, you can see that more and more HVDC can, I mean, in terms of distance and capacity, China, as I said, you know, is the model now because they're leading that. But we see lots of HVDC happening. We have done, we're doing studies with the connecting Ethiopia. We also had last year a workshop in India, and that's part of our initial discussion to explore connecting Asia. But I think the bottom line is that the collaboration has to go on. We have to have the right technologies. The technologies are there, it's improving, and it's just a matter of having the right collaboration and the right model to build these kind of technologies.
Thanks very much. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Connor from the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies. I'm a researcher there, and I focus on China's kind of Belt and Road Initiative and how recipient countries respond to that. And I was very interested with kind of the points raised about sovereignty with the final speaker. So I think maybe the narrative needs to shift slightly. So China and I believe the State Grid is probably one of the largest companies in the world, maybe the largest or second to Walmart or something like that. But China enjoys the asymmetry that it has in dealing with recipient countries and recipient partners in terms of its size, its expertise, and its coordination. And it's conducting these things on a more or less bilateral basis. And this is in contrast to European actors and US actors that want to, as you said, maybe latch on to some more regional initiatives and so on and so forth. But the narrative could shift slightly to say that China is actually just seeking a place to kind of funnel its excess capital, and it observes these high-risk investments that potentially have a high return, and it's aware that some of these risks will fail, right? And then from there, we say, what bearing does that have on sovereignty? Will China act on impinging on another actor's sovereignty because they can't pay back their debts? Or will they simply look the other way and they check it up to a lost investment? And I think we need to jump out of our Eurocentric and American-centric perspective in kind of predicting how China will behave in that regard. It can coerce recipient countries, but it may not necessarily act in the way that we would expect. So I was wondering if anyone on the panel had a comment on that.
Matt, would you like to address that? Appreciate the comment. I mean, I think that part of it is what do we think of or the assumptions we make on Chinese behavior. I mean, what you described is a scenario in which China is making its decisions for only economic gains. But that's an assumption, I think, and I don't know that it's a fact. That's not one that we would agree with in the United States government, is that there are larger motivations beyond just the economics. And certainly they're willing to throw away capital on potential projects, but there's always a multifaceted agenda and objectives. And the question for these countries is not just debt trap, but complete vulnerabilities of their grid connections. I mean, imagine going to the United States and saying you're going to connect your grid to the Chinese grid. Then you're going to accept all the vulnerabilities that come with that. That would never happen. But some of these countries may not have an alternative. And so what are all the dependencies and vulnerabilities that then introduces that come along with the capital availability that China is able to leverage? So I think, but certainly we could all envision a benevolent future in which China is leveraging its capital for economic gains only and for the betterment of each country's individual sovereignty. That's certainly a hope.
Yeah, and I would just maybe follow up and say, I think a lot of the questions also, this is why I think there's, questions have been raised by the Japanese and the US in terms of pursuing questions of what is really quality energy infrastructure. And so, what are we promoting? So that's not only, we're not just talking about the quality of the infrastructure, but we're talking about the quality of the deal and the transparency of the procurement. And I think that's where, some of the financing that might be essentially state subsidized financing or would come into play, and I think one of the things we talk about in this report is the room for expanding the definition of that quality infrastructure to talk about things like platform neutrality and also talk about things like cybersecurity. So to sort of expand the definition to reinforce that.
Greg DuPage, Global Energy Center, Atlantic Council. My question is for Engineer Abraham. How difficult is it to coordinate defense of critical infrastructure vulnerabilities across the GCCI countries, given the fact that every country has its own sovereignty and national security interests?
First of all, we've developed an interconnection transmission code that sets the conditions for operating the grid, and all through our agreements there are certain responsibilities and criteria that each member state have to abide with. We have joint committees like the operations committee and the planning committee, and each one is coordinating at a certain timeline. For the operation committee is coordinating these kind of vulnerabilities over short timeline, and then for the medium and long term, it's the planning committee. So we do continuously studies about operations, about planning, about the requirement of the systems, and we give targets to each member state. So for instance, we do planning ahead, 5 years ahead, and we give capacity targets for each member state, which is the minimum they have to meet. We give reserve requirement for each member state, and that's in the planning range. And then when we came to real-time operation, it's our control center, who we have our own control center interconnecting and coordinating operations between the 6 member states, and we monitor all these criteria, and we ensure that each of them meet the criteria. And if anybody who doesn't meet the criteria, we have a system of penalties and charges to charge them as an incentive to abide by the rules. So it is an elaborate system of checks and balances and planning and coordination that allows avoiding this kind, because You don't want somebody who can abuse the grid from his side to affect the other five. And you don't want free riders. Everybody should carry their weight. Everybody should abide by the criteria. We have the right to disconnect even those who don't abide by the rules and criteria, so that they don't negatively affect the others. So far, for the last 11 years, everybody has been behaving in a good way. We haven't seen any kind of abuse, and this is maybe part of, because of this elaborate system that we installed at different timelines.
May I follow up? Thank you. That's an excellent answer. Is your leadership, governance, and so forth a composition of the countries that are a part of GCCI? And by what means do you identify the leadership within GCCI?
You mean the people who participate?
Well, who are making the rules and enforcing the rules?
Well, and the structure we have, we are first of all we have policies which are issued at the level of the ministry. So we have an elaborate structure. So policies are at the level of ministers. We have the cabinet of ministers of electricity and water, and they issue the common policies that the interconnection will have to go by. We have a regulator. There's an advisory and regulatory committee, which is practically the regulator for the interconnector. They have certain roles in terms of regulatory roles and advisory roles for the ministers. So they have specific also rights and responsibilities and authorities. Then we have Then we have also the board of the GCC, which are the 6 member states represented at the level of undersecretaries and CEOs of electricity. And then we have the chairmanship of that is rotating. All the chairmanship of the regulator, the board, the operating committee, the planning committee, it's a rotating chairmanship, so that all the member states are represented more or less equally in these entities, and nobody has control actually. And even when we set up the shareholding, I think there was also lots of consideration given to the shareholding, so that no one member state can dictate what happens to the interconnection. So when it comes to the board, it's equal vote. When it comes to the board, the committees, it's equal share. And even if it's the General Assembly who are the owners of the GCIA, no one country can dictate what happens. So far this has been operating very well. It has been a well-coordinated decision-making on all aspects. And I think that is part of why this has been successful so far.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll just ask one more question before we close this out. We've talked a lot about the benefits of interconnection, and in the presence especially of growing amounts of renewables, and about a lot of the difficulties and time that it takes to actually engage with all this. But there's a lot of sort of evolving models also for, beyond just sort of the root and branch traditional method of thinking about the grids that are coming up now with a lot of, we talked about, a lot of innovations, particularly around distributed energy, and when we look at sort of the volume of distributed energy and microgrids that are potentially entering the market in places like India, where we have programs that are committed to providing over 5 million households with storage plus renewable microgrids that can also then help to balance the rest of the grid. What does that mean for the future value of cross-border transmission and trade in order to achieve that balancing? Can we see some kind of combination between sort of the bottom-up and the top-down when we think about some of these high-penetration renewable scenarios?
I think I always hear the argument that distributed grids or microgrids will replace the transmission grids. I hope not, but I don't think it will. I think both will evolve in a way, because these kind of new technologies and innovations is reshaping the business. Distribution networks will evolve, will become much more smarter, will have to have different models of operating. Transmission will also evolve. We'll have to innovate a little bit more. We'll have to have more smartness in all aspects. And I think all in all, we'll have more communication between the distribution system operators and the transmission system operator that will have a much efficient power grid. We are, in our part, also doing studies on that, especially with cybersecurity, also another partnership with IPRI. We're also doing studies on the implementation of blockchain and AI into our grid. From our side, we always took the lead as a GCC interconnection in implementing innovative technologies to improve our operations, because we started later than other grids. So that gives us the privilege of starting with new technologies. So we have, I would say, smarter technologies to allow us to operate more efficiently and have better response. And I think this will evolve in the future. And I think we will have more roles of the distribution system as well as the transmission system.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, Manali, we talked about leapfrogging. Engineer Ahmed talked about leapfrogging, the potential for technology to do that. Can the U.S. provide some sort of innovative models that are transferable then to some of these contexts?
Yeah, I think, something what you said, it has to be a combination of both the things. A bigger grid, transmission grid, which can, integrates all the countries, but also, a smart distributed system, because there are certain locations where you can't take the grid, and it makes more sense to have a distributed energy resources. And as far as US government is doing, as particularly I can talk about USAID, is we are, looking at validating some of those such technologies, and then we looking at how do you scale it up. So for instance, one of our projects, one of our activities in India specifically looks at innovative technologies such as battery energy storage, what value it can provide, and especially in combination with the renewable energy, with the solar plant, how much value it can provide in terms of not only helping in integration of renewable energy, but also to address some of the challenges what you are saying. So and that will continue to be one of the focus areas, part of Asia Edge as well. Advancement of technologies, microgrid, energy access, these are some of the key themes under Asia Edge. So going forward also we'll continue to look at it, not only on validating these technologies in Indian scenario, but also then taking these lessons learned to other countries in South Asia, which are still at that stage where renewable energy is not much of a priority as of now. We would be looking at how do we exchange cross-learning, encourage cross-learning, so that other countries can also learn what India is doing on RE front, microgrid, or in grid connected, and also on energy efficiency, which is another important theme.
Yeah, absolutely. Matt, do you have any last comments or something to add? No? Okay, great. Oh yeah, I mean, I really appreciate those last comments. I mean, I think what we talk about in the paper, it seems that indeed we're as we move forward over the next decade, technology is really going to bring us in both of those directions, right? So I mean, increasing the value of interconnection at a much higher level, but also movements towards decentralization on the other side. And so I think in the future we'll see a marriage of these two, which really sort of necessitates different ways. I mean, the first one is really about engaging, in international fora and building buy-in among some of these partners. But the second one is really a trend that will continue also in terms of decentralizing political power down to kind of the local level around some of these decisions. Great. Thank you very much, everyone here, for joining. I am supposed to tell you that you can access the report, which is also on the seats here, through the Global Energy Forum app. Now we'll continue into the ballroom at 3:45 for a finance innovation presentation on mobile power generation in Afghanistan. That sounds very interesting. So thank you very much to the panel for joining us. It was really a pleasure to have you, and for everyone here for participating. Thank you very much.